The secret wasn't in the horsemen. It wasn't the arrows. It wasn't the numbers, or the brutal tactics that had terrified 3 continents. It was the ground itself, and the man who'd chosen it with surgical precision, months before a single arrow flew. This is the story you think you already know about the Mongols in Syria. But it wasn't brute force that decided Homs. It was the meticulously prepared terrain, and they never saw it coming. But today you'll see how a former slave turned the battlefield into a hall of mirrors, and how the deadliest cavalry in history galloped straight to their own destruction because the ground looked exactly like what they needed. There is a question that medieval history books rarely answer satisfactorily, because the answer doesn't fit into a simple narrative. The Mongols conquered more territory than any military force before or since. From China to Poland, Vietnam to Persia, they demolished centuries-old empires, erased ancient cities, and wiped out entire populations with methodical industrial efficiency. No conventional army ever held them long enough to matter. But in Syria, they kept dying. Ayin Jalut, September 1260. First strategic Mongol defeat. A month later, December 1260, the First Battle of Homs. Second defeat. Then 1281 rolls around, and the Ilkhanate throws the largest force it's ever assembled at the Mamluks. Same terrain, same enemy, same result. What was going on there? This isn't about bravery or luck. It's about something colder, smarter. One man studied the most lethal war machine ever built, found the structural flaw at its core, and then designed a battlefield specifically to turn that crack into an abyss. The plain of Homs was a paradise flat, open, sun-baked, wide enough to maneuver. Exactly the terrain where they'd destroyed armies from Russia to Palestine. The Mongols saw that field and felt certain they'd finally found the place to crush the Mamluks. Men who'd never lost an open-field battle don't second-guess themselves. They didn't see the trap, because the trap was the terrain itself. To understand what Kalawun did, you need to understand what the Mongols were. Not the generic stuff, fierce nomadic cavalry. That's useless. You need the mechanics, because only then will you see how he tore that machine apart. Hardware, I know. You came here for epic cavalry battles, not a physics lesson on medieval bows. But there's a reason why a piece of ox bone changed the fate of 3 continents. Bear with me. The Mongol composite bow broke medieval warfare. It wasn't just bigger or stronger. Layers of birchwood, oxbone, and sinew glued into a curve that stored energy way beyond a single wood bow. Effective range, 200 to 300 meters. A trained Mongol horseman could fire 6 to 10 arrows a minute at full gallop. Think about that. Not standing still. Not planted on the ground. At a full gallop, twisting against the horse's motion, compensating for terrain, aiming with enough precision to pierce armor from 200 meters. That's a completely different kind of warrior. This changed medieval combat fundamentally. Conventional armies had to close the distance infantry with spears, cavalry with swords, archers who became useless in melee. The Mongols killed from range. Imagine bringing a rifle to a knife fight, except everyone on the Mongol side had one and knew how to use it at a gallop. But the composite bow was just the tool. It was their tactics that truly made them categorically superior. The trick, the feigned retreat. A Mongol force would attack, exchange fire, then break and run. Panic and chaos. The enemy saw victory and charged. Knights broke formation to chase the runners, each trying to be first. And that's exactly when it fell apart. Because that was the plan. The vanguard ran, but the main force was positioned in an arc, waiting. The enemy galloped straight into the trap formation, shattered, soldiers scattered, chasing the runners. Then the runners stopped and turned. The enemy was surrounded, disorganized, cut off from supply and support. The Mongol archers had them from all sides. This was total annihilation, massive scale. Flag and drum signals coordinating thousands of riders. It worked everywhere. Hungary, Iraq, China, Turkish cavalry, Russian infantry, Polish armies, cold weather, hot weather, spring, fall. This system was unbeatable. Operational speed sealed it. Mongol cavalry covered 80 to 130 kilometers a day, almost double any conventional army. They appeared where the enemy didn't expect them, struck before defenses could form, and disappeared before response. The Mongols didn't just own the open field. They decided when and where it happened. And the organization made it scalable. The Tumen 10,000 horsemen broke down into thousands, hundreds, tens, decimal precision. This meant tens of thousands of riders could flank while the center held pressure. An enemy facing one Tumen wouldn't realize the other Tumens were sweeping their flanks until they were already dead, from China to Poland, from Persia to Korea. This system absolutely destroyed everything it encountered, with one structural condition that was rarely discussed because it rarely mattered. It needed space. That's it. The feint only works if there's room to run and circle. Envelopment only works if cavalry can sweep the flanks without hitting obstacles. Speed's only an advantage in open terrain. And Tumens only stay coordinated if units can see each other, communicate by signals, and move freely. Take away the space, and the machine breaks. Confused horsemen in tight terrain, unable to use the tactics that made them legendary, packed into formations that fall apart without room to maneuver. That was the structural flaw, buried in the heart of the greatest military force the medieval world had ever known. And the man who was planning the 1281 battle knew exactly where this flaw was, because he had studied these horsemen with the obsessive attention of someone who knows their very survival depends on understanding them. To understand why he returned in 1281 with the largest force the Ilkhanate had ever assembled, you need to understand what had happened before, and why the Mongols simply wouldn't accept that this region could be lost. By 1260, the Mongols had reached all the way to Cairo in their plans. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, had destroyed Baghdad in February 1258 with a brutality that still reverberates in historical accounts. The Abbasid Caliphate, the spiritual and political center of the Islamic world for 5 centuries, the city that had been the intellectual capital of the Arab world, the home of thousands of irreplaceable manuscripts, was simply wiped out. Hulagu killed the caliph rolled up in carpets so that royal blood wouldn't touch the ground, a detail that says everything about the calculated coldness with which Mongol power treated the institutions the rest of the world considered sacred or untouchable. But in September 1260, at Ain Jalut, something changed. Kitbuka, the Mongol general, was defeated and captured by the Mamluks under Kutus and Baibars. It was the first Mongol defeat in the open field with real strategic weight, and it wasn't a fluke, as the events of a month later would confirm. At the First Battle of Homs, in December 1260, the Mamluks defeated another Mongol force. The pattern was beginning to take shape. The Ilkhanate, the Mongol state that controlled Persia, Iraq, and parts of Anatolia, the direct heir to Hulagu's conquests, didn't forget. They didn't forgive. And they didn't interpret these defeats as a message about what was strategically possible. They interpreted them as anomalies that needed to be corrected with overwhelming force. Abaka Khan, Hulagu's son, spent the 1260s and 1270s trying to build a coalition capable of solving the Mamluk problem permanently. The logic was simple within the Mongol paradigm. They had been defeated twice by smaller forces. This was, in the Mongol calculation, an administrative aberration that needed to be fixed with more soldiers and better coordination, not a structural trend that required a different strategic response. For the 1281 campaign, Abaka gathered the largest force he had ever sent against the Sultanate, between 80,000 and 100,000 combatants, depending on the sources you consult. Heavy and light Mongol cavalry, trained on the steppes since childhood. Armenians under Leo III of Armenian Cilicia, a loyal vassal of the Ilkhanate, whose cavalry was fast, aggressive, and familiar with the Syrian terrain. Georgian contingents, possibly Crusader sympathies on the fringes. Munka Temür, Hulagu's nephew, and an experienced general in the Ilkhanate campaigns, commanded the field operations. The strategic plan was straightforward with the ordered brutality characteristic of Mongol military thinking. Advance in force into Syria, destroy the Mamluk army in the open field before it could reorganize its defense, take Damascus, and then continue the advance into Egypt. What Hulagu had tried and failed, Abaka would try again, but this time with a force that simply shouldn't be defeatable by any army available in the Levant. The Mongols were coming, and they believed victory was inevitable. Munka Temür advanced through Syria as if he were just checking another box on the Ilkhanate's conquest list. One more sultanate to be swept away, one more obstacle to be erased with the devastating efficiency that had destroyed everything from Baghdad to Poland. Munka Temür was a general who understood the patterns that had given the Ilkhanate its victories, maintained pressure on multiple fronts, Use numerical superiority to force the enemy to choose where they would be vulnerable. Exploit any break in formation with a speed that gave the enemy no time to reorganize. It was a tactical playbook tested in dozens of campaigns. It had worked from Armenia to Anatolia. It had worked against armies that, on paper, should have been able to offer resistance. And at Homs, Mongol Timur had more available force than in any of these previous campaigns. He had concrete reasons to believe he was on the right side of probability. Mamluk intelligence picked up the mobilization well in advance. Messengers arrived in Cairo with growing reports about the size of the force gathering in the north. And the Sultan of Egypt, a man named Qalawun, had to make a decision on how to respond to something that was significantly larger than any force he could put in the open field. Qalawun. The name doesn't evoke epic images for most people. It should. He was bought as a slave child or teenager, probably from the Chipchak steppes. The same steppes the Mongols rode out from. Sultan al-Salih Ayyub paid 1,000 gold dinars for him, unusual price. That's why he became known as Al-Alfi, the one of 1,000. Al-Salih Ayyub knew talent when he saw it. The Mamluks were a system of enslaved warriors trained from childhood for combat. Nothing else. Barracks, horsemanship, archery, swordsmanship, battle, year after year. Loyalty went to the regiment, to the sultan, to the system. The best rose fast. Meritocracy, driven by survival. Qalawun fought in the 1250s and 60s, when the Mamluks learned Mongol tactics firsthand, not from books, from battle. He watched them maneuver. He studied the Tumans. He understood the Mongol cavalry's instincts, the urge to chase, to exploit every opening. He was trained in the same steppe system that built the Mongols. He knew them from the inside. In 1279, through a combination of political skill and an irreproachable military reputation, Qalawun became Sultan of Egypt. And then he learned that the largest Mongol army in history was marching his way. This is where the situation gets deeply complicated. And you need to understand this layer, because it's the key to everything that follows. The Mamluk right flank was commanded by Sunkur al-Ashkar, governor of Damascus, military guy, real authority, and recently a traitor. In 1280, 1 year before the battle, Sunkur proclaimed himself Sultan of Syria. Open treason. But with the Mongols closing in, internal civil war was suicide. Negotiations, pressure, the threat of invasion. Sunkur reconciled. Formally. Qalawun knew that formally and reliably were rarely the same word. And now this man, whose loyalties were genuinely uncertain, who had personal reasons to want to see Qalawun struggle, who had recently shown independent ambitions, this man would be positioned on the right flank of the Mamluk army. On the flank that would be directly opposite the Armenian cavalry of Leo III, the most aggressive and fastest element of the Mongol coalition. Tell me something. If you were Qalawun, knowing that the man on your right flank had proclaimed himself Sultan of Syria 12 months ago, and that now, with the largest Mongol army in history days away, you needed him for the battle, what would you do? Would you trust him? Would you replace him and lose the troops he brings? Or would you find a way to turn that uncertainty into a weapon? Any military analyst reviewing this troop deployment would raise an eyebrow. The obvious question was this an error in judgment? Strategic incompetence? A pragmatic necessity? Did Sunkur have troops that were needed, and there was no way to integrate them into the center without major risks? Or was Qalawun planning to use Sunkur for something specific? Hold on to that question. The answer comes later, and when it does, it will reshape everything you thought you understood about this battle. Qalawun was different. He refused to let the Mongols dictate the battle terms. Every army the Mongols destroyed had done the same thing, fought under Mongol conditions. Qalawun understood. Choosing the battlefield was the entire game, the plain of Homs. Let's talk about this precisely, because this is where the genius lives. The plain northeast of Homs looks perfect. Flat, wide open, long-distance visibility. The exact terrain where the Mongols had dominated from Mongolia to Central Europe. That's the trap. Surface appearance, nothing more. The Orontes River runs along the western edge. Marshlands, waterlogged soil that gets worse toward the river. From a distance or from quick scout reports, the plain looks perfectly open, but the western side's degraded, and you don't notice until you're in it. until the horses start sinking into ground that looked solid 200 meters back. Not a wall, not a cliff. Terrain that slowly degrades. Exactly what you don't notice at full gallop. Kalawun positioned his army so that the western flank of the battlefield, the marshy terrain, would be exactly where Leo III's Armenian cavalry, the most aggressive element of the Mongol coalition, would be operating after they advanced. Think about what this means in terms of Mongol mechanics. The maneuver works like this. A force retreats. The enemy pursues, the enemy spreads out in the chase, and the main force closes the trap. For this envelopment maneuver to work on a Mongol scale, the main force needs to be able to sweep widely around the pursuing enemy. That sweeping motion requires unrestricted lateral space. If the flank is constrained by a river, by a marsh, by anything that degrades the ground, that wide sweep becomes impossible, or at the very least much slower and far more costly. And there's another layer to this. For the coordination of the Tumans to work in a battle of 80,000 to 100,000 men, units need space to move independently while maintaining communication and visibility with one another. If the usable combat area is narrower than the formation requires, units begin to compress against each other, blocking each other's movements, losing the independence of maneuver that makes them individually lethal. The machine starts working against itself. But the most crucial element was what the terrain selection did to the Mamluk right flank, Sunkor's flank. The Mamluk right flank was positioned in such a way that if it collapsed or retreated, any force pursuing it would be naturally funneled toward the worst terrain near the Orontes. Not in an obvious way from the Mongol perspective, evaluating it from the north. From the north, the pursuit looked like wide open space. From the north, it looked like the perfect opportunity to exploit a flank breakthrough. But as the pursuit pushed forward, the ground beneath the horses' hooves would worsen subtly, and then, not so subtly. This is what a desert mirage trap means in precise terms. The plain appeared to be a Mongol cavalry paradise wide open, flat, exactly the kind of battlefield where their tactics produced devastating results. What the Mongols couldn't see was that this specific field had been chosen with the precision of an engineer designing a snare, calibrated to funnel the coalition's most aggressive force right into the terrain that would dissolve their effectiveness. The plain was the bait. The Orontes was the wall they wouldn't see until their horses were sinking slightly into the waterlogged soil, and their lines had already collapsed in the thrill of the chase. You know the question a strategist should be asking here. How do you get the Mongol cavalry to go exactly where you want them to go? Kalawun's answer: you give them something irresistible to chase, and Sunkor al-Ashkar willingly, or unwillingly, would be that bait. October 29th, 1281. The plain northeast of Homs. Morning air, dust, the scent of tens of thousands of horses. Not silence tension. That moment before everything breaks. Everyone felt it. Both sides. The two armies position themselves while the morning sun is still low on the horizon. On the Mamluk side, Kalawun with his elite Bari Mamluks in the center and commanding the left flank. Sunkur al-Ashkar with his forces on the Mamluk right flank. On the opposite side of the plain, Munka Timur with the main Mongol force in the center and left. Leo III of Cilician Armenia with his cavalry on the Mongol right flank, directly opposite Sunkor's flank. This mirrored arrangement was no coincidence. It was deliberate tactical geometry. When the battle begins, it unfolds exactly as Kalawun had calculated. Leo III's Armenian cavalry presses first and strikes hard on the right side, charging against Sunkor's flank with the speed and aggression characteristic of the Armenian warriors who had fought as Mongol vassals across multiple campaigns. Sunkor's flank takes the impact. Then it breaks. No orderly retreat. No tactical control. It breaks. Sunkor's units collapse under the Armenian charge, and Sunkor al-Ashkar, the rebel, the guy who'd proclaimed himself Sultan of Syria just 1 year ago, flees. Not a retreat. A rout. With half his troops right behind him. It looks catastrophic. Right flank collapsed. Force abandoned. Completely exposed. Leo III and his cavalry surge forward. Unopposed. Munka Timur's left flank crushes against Kalawun's center with tens of thousands of horsemen. A field report would say, right flank broken, commander fled, enemy driving deep, center under pressure, critical situation. That's what it looked like. And it's exactly what the Mongols needed to see. because the truth was completely different. Leo III's pursuit was happening, and it was taking place on the exact terrain Kalawun had chosen for it to happen. As they galloped forward, three things were happening. Each alone would cripple them. Together, fatal. First, they're moving toward bad ground, Orontes marshlands. Every 100 meters, the soil gets worse. The horses don't slow. The push forward masks the change until it's too late. By then, formation's already gone. Second, pursuit shatters formation. Fast horses pull ahead. Slow ones fall behind. Flanks spread. Coordinated cavalry unit becomes scattered riders in chase mode. Third, decisive. The Armenian cavalry separated from the Mongol center. The right flank drove deep, but the center stalled against Kalawun's cavalry. The Mongol line is breaking. The center was supposed to crush them. It didn't. Munka Temur expected the flank collapse to cascade. Right side gone, open exposure. Commander fled. The Mamluks should break in panic. But Kalawun is in the center with the best Bari warriors alive. These men were trained their entire lives for this exact moment. The center doesn't unravel, doesn't break. It absorbs the hit, holds ground, and starts counterattacking where the Mongol formation compresses. The battlefield narrowed as the Mongols pushed forward. 80 to 100,000 men who looked unstoppable on open plains got squeezed into terrain too tight. Units jammed together, blocking each other, losing the space they needed to maneuver. The machine broke. Then Kalawun moved. The Bari cavalry holding the center pivoted, not to retreat. A flanking rotation sweeping around the Mongol center's open side. At the same time, Leo III's cavalry scattered across the marshes near the Orontes faced reality. The swampy ground bogged them down. Their formation shattered, and Mamluk units blocked any path back to the center. Military historians call this defeat in detail. A separated force facing concentrated enemy fire, with no escape. The Armenian cavalry wasn't beaten because riders were inferior. They were wiped out because they were trapped on bad ground, cut off from the center, with broken ranks and nowhere to run. Leo III managed to escape with a fraction of his forces, his best riders, the ones who recognized the danger early enough to pull back before the total collapse. But for all practical military purposes, the Armenian contingent had been eliminated as an effective fighting force in that battle. This is where the issue of Sankor truly matters, and where historians still can't agree. Sankor fled. That is an indisputable historical fact. What remains fiercely debated is whether Kalawun knew he would flee, and if he had built his entire battle plan around it. Perhaps Sunkor fled out of sheer cowardice, breaking under the pressure of an Armenian cavalry charge that was simply too massive, leaving Kalawun to improvise brilliantly in the face of a genuine disaster. Perhaps it was deliberate treason, Sunkor wanting to see Kalawun defeated so that Syria would once again be politically up for grabs, failing to realize that his collapsing flank would trigger the exact opposite of what he intended. Or perhaps, and this is the most unsettling theory, the retreat was orchestrated between the two of them from the start. A tactical feint executed using the actual right flank. Treachery used as a weapon. The very man Kalawun couldn't trust was transformed, for that exact reason, into the one element of the battle plan the Mongols could never have anticipated. None of these three theories can be definitively proven by the surviving historical sources. But here is what we can say for sure. Regardless of Sunkor's true intentions, the outcome of his flight was structurally identical to what a deliberate, feigned retreat would have achieved. And Kalawun had a heavy Bahri cavalry force perfectly positioned and trained to execute exactly what the situation now demanded. In the center, Munka Temur was now facing every Mongol commander's worst strategic nightmare: force fragmentation in constricted terrain. His own advance had stalled. The flank that was supposed to deliver the breaking blow was cut off and being systematically dismantled. And the flawless coordination between Tumans that made the Mongols so unstoppable in the open field was now splintering as their tactical space shrank and communication between units broke down. Munka Temur ordered retreat. Kalawun pressed hard but calculated, not the wild pursuit that had destroyed so many armies chasing Mongols. Just enough pressure to bleed them out without exposing his cavalry to their counterstrikes. By end of day, October 29, 1281, the entire Mongol-Armenian army fled north from Homs. The Mamluk Sultanate had just survived the largest invasion the Ilkhanate would ever throw at them. Casualties were heavy on both sides. The exact numbers are lost to the fog of medieval chronicles. But Leo III's Armenian contingent was battered so severely that it crippled the kingdom of Cilician Armenia militarily for years. The Mongol forces suffered losses that, when combined with the results of Ain Jalut and the First Battle of Homs, established a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as a mere anomaly. 1282. Abaka Khan died. A Mongol Khan's death meant succession wars. Power was personal, fiercely contested. Every resource went to internal fighting. The window for another Egypt campaign slammed shut. Abaka's heirs fought each other. There were later incursions. In 1299, the Ilkhanate under Ghazan invaded Syria again, temporarily capturing Damascus. In 1303, at the Battle of Marj al-Safar, the Mamluks defeated the Mongols once more. But none of these campaigns, none of the pushes that came after Homs 1281, ever seriously threatened the Mamluk hold on Egypt. With every Mongol campaign, the Mamluk response grew more calibrated, more efficient, more confident. The Ilkhanate was done. Syria stayed Mamluk. The Cairo Sultanate built by slaves who became the deadliest warriors alive had stopped the Mongols for good. Before we move on, what just happened? The Ilkhanate sent its largest force ever against a smaller army. By medieval math, the Mongols should have won. 2-1 advantage. Open field. But it didn't happen because the battlefield itself nullified those numbers. Sunkur al-Ashkar, interestingly enough, continued to exist in the orbit of Mamluk power for years. His story ends without the dramatic trial or execution you would expect for a commander who fled at the most critical moment of an existential battle. What that says about Kalawun, about what he knew, what he had planned, what he had arranged, belongs to the silence that most truly important strategic decisions leave behind. So what does Homs 1281 really teach us? Because if you just look at the numbers, a smaller army defeating a larger one, it simply looks like another historical exception. But it is not an exception. It is the most precise demonstration of a pattern that shows up repeatedly in every situation where mobility is one side's primary weapon. The Mongols lost at Ain Jalut. They lost at the First Battle of Homs. They lost at the Second Battle of Homs. They lost in their attempts to invade Japan twice against typhoons and coastal terrain that neutralized their steppe cavalry. They lost in parts of Southeast Asia against jungle that dismantled their operational mobility. The pattern is consistent to the point that it cannot be ignored. Mobility is only a weapon when there is operational space to use it. That sounds obvious when stated like that. But the sinister beauty of what Kalawun did at Homs is that he didn't create a battlefield where the Mongols lacked space. He created a battlefield where the Mongols believed they had space. The plain was a mirage. The Mongols arrived at the battlefield and saw exactly what they wanted to see. Openness, opportunity, terrain that promised to enable their tactics. They saw an enemy that had made the mistake of positioning itself in the open field where Mongol cavalry would dominate. They didn't see the western edge gradually sloping down toward the Orontes. They didn't calculate how far the pursuit of a collapsed flank would pull them out of cohesion with their own center. They didn't realize the field had been specifically chosen so that their most aggressive element would be funneled into the exact terrain that would break their alignment precisely when they needed formation to survive the counterattack. The trap wasn't the river. The trap was the entire field designed to look like exactly what the Mongols needed to win, while containing the precise conditions to destroy them. Strategic genius is different from competence. Competence is fighting better on enemy terms. Genius is changing the terms so the enemy's strengths don't matter before the first shot. Kalawun didn't outfight the Mongols on their field. He refused it. He built an identical-looking field, calibrated to turn their greatest strength into their fatal weakness. He turned the pursuit of opportunity, an open flank, into the weapon that destroyed them. The plain of Homs wasn't a battlefield. It was a question. What happens to history's greatest cavalry when the one thing that makes them unbeatable gets taken away while they think they've still got it? October 29th, 1281 answered it. The Ilkhanate never recovered. So comment. If you were Munka Timur, knowing what you know now about the terrain, about Sunkur, about the trap, what would you do different? And if you want the next piece, how Kalawun's spy network tracked the Ilkhanate for months before 1281, subscribe.